Okay. Good evening, everybody. Happy spring and welcome to the Transport and Protection Quiz Review live stream for Biology 2019. It's a Wednesday night, so I'm not sure how many of you are out there, but we'll help out whoever's here. So far I've got Ronit and Grace. Good to see you guys. And whenever you're ready, we don't have to wait for more people. Go ahead and just chime in, get your question in there. I'm going to try to be kind of efficient tonight, so go ahead and enter a question as soon as you have one. Okay, while I'm waiting, I'll give a good general introduction here. So just a couple quick reminders. Remember that this quiz has a lot more completion than you might be used to. So you're going to make sure you review your vocabulary list and that you would feel comfortable coming up with any of those words off the top of your head, and that you would be able to spell them accurately as well. So you might want to even try writing out some of the harder ones. I know some of the words on the list are a little challenging to spell. So give that a practice before you start, and that might make you feel a little bit more confident. Otherwise, it really is pretty much based on the things we've been practicing in class, so I don't think you'll find anything shocking on there. It is pretty well covered in the review sheet that you got in class and some of the other activities that we've done. Grace, yeah, I see that. I think I can change the title while it's going. I'm not sure if I can for sure. Let me try to do that while we're waiting for some people here. Thanks for noticing. I wasn't sure if I had to wait until after the video was over to do that. Okay, I think I got it. Should look a little bit better. Okay, Ronit, you're asking about heart attacks and cardiac arrest. Yeah, I don't know if I would. There sometimes is a physical connection, but they really are two sort of separate things. So to clarify, remember that a heart attack is really well, they're both blood flow problems. Okay, let me start that over. A heart attack results from atherosclerosis, right? Specifically when the plaque, which is the result of the process of atherosclerosis, when the plaque builds up in those tiny coronary arteries, when a piece of that plaque breaks off, we call it ruptures, then your body treats that as if it needs to repair any kind of a wound or a cut. So the platelets very quickly attach to that area where the plaque ruptured, and a clot starts to form. And in a fairly short period of time, the platelets and the blood clotting mechanism will actually fill the artery, which remember is not very big to begin with, right? So it's going to fill that artery, it's going to stop the blood flow, and that means that any of the coronary arteries downstream are not going to get a blood supply, which means all the heart cells that were fed by that area that is fed by that artery aren't going to be getting fresh blood with oxygen and glucose. So that means they're not going to be able to do cellular respiration, which means they're not going to be able to produce ATP, which means they're going to die pretty quickly. It's not immediate. Heart attacks can take minutes to hours even, and they can be minor or major depending on the amount of the heart that's affected, the portion of the heart that's affected. But it's essentially a problem of atherosclerosis and blocking of the artery and preventing this blood flow and cells dying from oxygenation. Okay, so if you're going to try to solve that problem, you need to open up those arteries, which gets you to processes like inserting a stent. Okay, cardiac arrest, totally different problem. Cardiac arrest has to do with the fact that your heart is not rhythmically beating correctly, because the individual cells are no longer contracting. They're muscle cells. They're no longer contracting simultaneously. So all the many cardiac muscle cells that make up your heart, at least within the atria and then within the ventricles, have to contract at approximately the same time in order for the whole portion of the heart to actually contract and squeeze the blood. And what can happen, and that of course is controlled by the area of the heart called the pacemaker, the cells that sort of send out this electrical rhythm and keep all of the cells in the same rhythm with each other, synchronous, we would say. And if that pacemaker is for whatever reason unable to maintain that rhythmic electrical signal, then in some cases the little signals sent out by the individual cardiac cells will start to become uncoordinated with each other and chaotic, and different cells will be contracting at different times, and so the heart will just sort of shimmer and shimmy and shake. And we call that fibrillation, and especially if it's ventricular fibrillation, the lower portions of the heart, that is going to stop the chambers of the heart from effectively actually squeezing closed and pumping the blood out. Okay, so that's actually a much more sudden problem, because if you can't pump any blood at all out of the whole heart, it's not just that heart cells are going to die gradually, but now you're not pumping any blood out of the heart at all to the rest of the body or to the lungs. And the immediate problem is that the blood pressure just drops like a stone, and the person's probably going to collapse, because now they're not going to get any blood to their brain, and any oxygenation to the brain or the rest of the body is going to pretty much come to a halt. So at that point, the person will die within really just a few minutes if they don't, if the heart does not restart its normal rhythm. And unfortunately, when the heart goes into fibrillation, it generally doesn't go back to a normal rhythm on its own. So that is why this sort of idea of cardiac arrest, sudden cardiac death, is so catastrophic, because if you don't get there within the first few minutes with an AED or some other kind of device like that, you're not going to be able to keep the person alive. Sometimes if you can do CPR for a little while and then get them an AED, that might work, but it's an immediate crisis. Now the term cardiac arrest isn't quite the same. Cardiac arrest can be used anytime the heart stops. To arrest something is to stop it. You don't necessarily die from cardiac arrest, and it's not always caused by this electrical problem. I think most of the time it is. I'm not sure about that. So, but the idea is that we could say, oh, you would go into cardiac arrest. If it is this kind of catastrophic ventricular fibrillation and the heart stops, you will most likely die of sudden cardiac death. Okay? Now, the connection between the two is that in the heart, when a heart attack is occurring, okay, that's my kitty's tail. Sorry about that. Hello, say hello to our audience tonight. That's Pinky. In the heart, when a heart attack is occurring, because the cells are kind of in trauma and starting to run out of oxygen and become stressed and potentially die, that tends to make these electrical signals more chaotic. Okay, so it is not uncommon for a person who is in the middle of having a heart attack, this somewhat more drawn out process of not enough blood flow through the coronary arteries, heart cells dying, okay, but in the middle of that process, their heart could suddenly go into fibrillation. Now all the cells are not contracting in unison at the same time, and the heart will stop pumping blood. And it's really irrelevant at that point whether the heart cells are getting any oxygen, right? Because they're not able to pump it all anyway. So, if you're in an emergency setting, they would fix the fibrillation first and then continue to treat the heart attack. So cardiac arrest sometimes occurs in the midst of a heart attack, but it's not the same thing at all. And you can have cardiac arrest occur without a heart attack at all. And you can have a heart attack without cardiac arrest occurring, okay? So they are separate, but sometimes occur one as a result of the other, okay? It would be cardiac arrest as a result of a heart attack. I don't think there's no reason it would be the other way around, okay? So it's a little bit of a longer explanation, but that was a complicated topic. Okay, so hi, Suchita. She's asking about the septum. The septum is really to divide the left and right sides. So think about why that's important. The right side of the heart has, think about this before I say it, which kind of blood? Deoxygenated. Okay, so the right side of the heart has deoxygenated blood, which means the left side has oxygenated blood. And if you didn't have a septum and you just let those mix, if you just let blood come into the heart and then squeeze it back out again, you would have this kind of like semi-oxygenated blood, right? But what you want for effective oxygenation of your cells is for the blood to have the highest possible concentration of oxygen. Because remember, the oxygen moves into the cells by diffusion, and it's going to go faster if there's a greater concentration difference between the blood and the cells. Ooh, that's a good reminder from cell bio that just might be on the final exam, right? So that's one of the things that affects the rate of diffusion. So if you have blood that is not well oxygenated, you're going to get a slower rate of diffusion of oxygen to your cells. Okay, so it's more efficient to separate the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, let it pump out in the separate double loop so that you keep the blood in systemic circulation as highly oxygenated as possible. Okay, now interestingly, not all animals have a four-chambered heart, right? Actually, not all animals have a heart, but even with animals that have a heart, sometimes it's a simple sort of one-chambered thing that just blood goes in and squishes back out again, right? Sometimes there's two chambers or three chambers. Having a four-chambered heart is an adaptation that allows mammals to more quickly oxygenate their cells more efficiently. And that goes along with a number of other adaptations we have that allow us to be sort of more high energy organisms, right? And remember that having the big brains that we have and being very active requires a tremendous amount of oxygen. So it's part of a set of adaptations that allows us to oxygenate our cells much more efficiently. Hi, Jay, welcome. Okay, so Ron's asking another heart question. What happens when the valves leak blood? How do the organs in different body systems get affected? Okay, so that's actually a perfect segue from the last question, because when the valves are leaking blood, again, it's really kind of a matter of efficiency, right? If you try to pump blood from the ventricle and like half of it's squishing back into the atrium, you just don't even get as much effective blood out, right? So, or say that you're trying to pump it in through the pulmonary artery and it's like falling back down into the ventricles because the valve's leaking, okay? You're just not going to get as an effective pumping of blood. You won't get as much blood, right? And that could affect the ability of your blood to oxygenate all of your cells. So it can be very problematic, and you'll tend to have more symptoms, you know, like fatigue and stuff like that, where you're not going to have the stamina that you would have if your heart was able to pump more effectively. And then what happens, this is a little beyond the scope of our course, but just to kind of expand the whole picture, it makes your heart basically have to work harder, and then sometimes the heart starts to become enlarged and less healthy, and so it can actually be life-threatening. That being said, many people do have minor valve leaks that go on for quite a long time, and if it's minor, they may not even be that aware of it. If it becomes more of a significant problem, it may be something that needs to be fixed. And there are ways that we can either repair a valve or replace it with an artificial valve. Sometimes they use pig valves. I don't know if they still do, but they used to. So that's kind of another interesting thing that we can do. Let's see. She was asking about fibrinogens. So fibrinogens is one of the, I don't know if it's technically called a clotting factor, but it's a protein in your blood. And remember that that word, root OGEN, signifies that it's a form of the protein that is a precursor, right? So the idea is that you have all this fibrinogen in your blood, and under the right circumstances, when it is stimulated, and I think this is part of the clotting process, what stimulates it, when it is stimulated to convert into fibrin, then that fibrin can immediately act to form fibers, right? So this kind of like thicker, stronger material that will help to form a much stronger blood clot or a scab, okay? But that's a really powerful process. Blood clots can kill you, right, if they form in the wrong places. So what you want is the ability to form a blood clot rapidly, right? So you want the fibrinogen floating in your blood all the time, but you want to be able to activate it only very carefully when absolutely needed, okay? So that's why this system of being able to activate the always present fibrinogen into fibrin just when it's needed to form a blood clot is a really valuable part of our blood clotting process. Okay, Shree's asking about infusing saline solution in a person. Okay, how does that restore blood volume? So blood volume is the actual amount of blood we have. Like you could measure it. It's like how many liters of blood, right? And it's one of the things that helps us to maintain our blood pressure. Okay, if there's less literal liquid volume of blood in our blood vessels, it's lower pressure. Just like if you turn, you know, the tap on the sink down, the water's on, or on the shower, right? If you turn the amount of water down, it's lower pressure. It doesn't hit you as hard, right? If you turn the amount of water up, it hits you harder. It's higher pressure. Okay? So if a person loses a large amount of blood, their blood pressure immediately it goes down. And again, similar to the concept of sudden cardiac death, if the blood pressure drops suddenly, that means that blood is not reaching your brain very effectively. So you're going to pass out and potentially die pretty quickly. If you lose a large amount of blood, and I think it's something like 30 to 40%, you're going to die from that, okay? Because you just cannot effectively move the blood to your tissues, especially your brain, okay? So what's good about saline solution is that you can immediately pump up the amount of blood. You can add a liter of saline, right? So that the amount of blood stays the same and your blood pressure is able to be maintained even though the blood itself is diluted. Okay? So in an emergency, that's a good way to keep you from dying from this drop in blood pressure. Okay? Now, the problem with that, of course, is that the saline doesn't contain red blood cells and clotting factors and platelets and all the other things you need in your blood. So it's more of a short-term measure to pump up your blood volume. Sometimes it's also done if there just simply isn't a lot of blood product to give you, right? So sometimes we'll give people some saline and some blood in order to kind of conserve the blood that we have. So those are some of the reasons we would give saline. Rana does another question about how do red blood cells still produce energy without a mitochondria? Rana, remember your cell biology in the little picture, right? So if there is oxygen, aerobic, then mitochondria, or a bacterial cell who can do this, does cellular respiration. If there is no oxygen, okay, then you go down one of these fermentation branches. If it's an animal like us, it's going to be lactic acid fermentation. And remember, it's enough to produce a little bit of ATP, not as much as cellular respiration, but the reality is red blood cells hardly need any energy. They're really just floating vessels of of hemoglobin. Okay, they just float through your capillaries, pushed along by the pressure, right, and carrying all this hemoglobin. So they don't need much energy at all in order to function, a very minimal amount. And lactic acid fermentation is plenty for that. Okay, Rakshita, hello. Not sure who you are, but welcome. Oh, it's Rayan. Okay, you're on your sister's account. Okay, well, welcome, and thank you, sister. So if platelets allow your blood to clot. Oh, okay, so you're asking why it is that you need platelets and blood clotting and fibrinogen. So blood clotting, as I mentioned, is this super powerful process, right? And it's very carefully controlled, and it's somewhat complicated to do because you need an immediate blockage of the blood, which is the platelets. But then the platelets aren't very strong; they're just these little fragments, and the blood would eventually sort of push through that. Okay, so then you need to have these other chemical reactions that occur and form these much more solid fibers, and fibrinogen is involved with that. The full blood clotting process is something like 10 or 12 steps of first the platelets, but then these various proteins activating other proteins and converting into other materials so that eventually you get a pretty solid longer term clot / scab material that's going to allow the cells to heal and you won't lose more blood. Okay, so there's actually a bunch of things involved that are, beyond the scope of this class, right? But there's a very long process of all these molecules. So platelets is the short-term one. Fibrinogen is helping to build the longer-term sort of repair material that's gonna be more permanent than the platelets. Okay, not totally permanent, but more permanent than the platelets. Hi, Nishat. So you're asking about how allergens and autoimmune disease are a failure of homeostasis. Okay, so this is a kind of a neat use of the term homeostasis. We think of it as kind of a condition like temperature or blood glucose, right? They can be too high or too low. So you kind of want to think of your immune response as that condition, right? And it can be too high or too low. So if you have a really strong immune response, it can kill you. Okay, the most dramatic example of this is when people go into anaphylactic shock, which is what happens sometimes when they have a severe food allergy. You've probably heard of people who have peanut allergies or some of these really severe allergies where when they get that substance, their body goes into such a strong immune reaction that you literally kill yourself, right? Because the main thing that actually kills people is that their bronchial tubes constrict so much that they can't get any air in. Okay, and there's a bunch of other things that happen as part of that response. But that's too strong of an immune response, and it's potentially deadly. But you need to have some immune response to fight against pathogens, right? If the response is too low, then perhaps you can't fight against pathogens, right? And we might call you immune compromised, right? So if you're immune compromised, you might not have enough of an immune response to really fight things off, right? So an example of that would be conditions like AIDS, right? Where you just don't really have enough of an immune response to be effective, and you're probably going to die from some fairly simple infection because you can't fight it off. Okay, if we want to connect that to autoimmune disease, that's again in the too much direction, because now you're having an immune response, not that immediately kills you, but that starts to attack your own cells. Okay, and that may not kill you immediately, but you're probably going to have some difficult chronic disease, type 1 diabetes, lupus, multiple sclerosis, depending on what part of the body is attacked. You're going to have some kind of problem with that. Okay, so both of those, the ones that you mentioned, autoimmune disease and allergies, represent too much immune response. But again, you can also have too little. So your body's trying to kind of maintain this nice balance of responding appropriately when it needs to, but not responding to things that it doesn't need to. Okay. Okay. So Sachita will connect that to your question. So what is immune tolerance? So that ties into this idea of enough and too much of an immune response, okay? So immune tolerance means that you don't respond too much. You're able to tolerate certain things, like the presence of your own antigens, okay? So you want to not respond to things that are, you know, your pet's hair, your pet's hair or skin, or peanuts, or your own cells, right? So you need to be tolerant of those. And that's part of what happens during the development of immunocompetence, is when your immune cells sort of, are selected. They don't really, learning is actually not accurate. We sort of say that, but they're sort of selected to be appropriately responsive to things they need to be responsive to. And if that process goes wrong, then they sometimes respond to the wrong kinds of things, and then you might end up with an autoimmune disease or allergies. And then you're asking about permanent immunity as well. So the idea there is that when you have a primary immune response, okay, and remember the primary immune response can occur because you've been exposed to an actual pathogen, right? So I got this particular strain of the flu, and I formed some particular white blood cells were selected that matched that. Those white blood cells produced antibodies that matched the antigens on that flu virus, okay? And then some of those antibodies, well, a whole lot of those antibodies, most of them attack the flu, right? But then that sort of all goes away within a couple weeks, right? The flu virus is gone, most of the antibodies go away, and most of the white blood cells that multiplied go away. But a few of the white blood cells and some of the antibodies in some cases stay, right? And what that means is later on, if I'm exposed to that exact same strain of the flu again with the same antigen, then I'll be able to respond to it very quickly. That's a secondary immune response, right? So quickly, in fact, that it probably won't ever get a hold and infect my cells and spread to any noticeable degree, okay? And then I would have permanent immunity for that. That doesn't always occur. For whatever reason, I don't entirely understand this, some things don't give us permanent immunity. We have more temporary immunity, okay? And in those cases, if it's a vaccine, we would need to get booster shots, for example, right? Sometimes you don't get these longer term or not very long term memory cells or antibodies. You have to sort of boost it, okay? So that does happen. But some things, once you become immune and have the memory cells, you have those for the rest of your life. Saranat's asking about smoking and chronic bronchitis. Okay, and I'm just going to check to see. I see some other questions about smoke. Okay, it is a little bit more than that. We have a visitor here who said that it's caused by repeated irritants, and the tobacco smoke is also an irritant. So that's part of the story. Anything that's an irritant like that, so it could be air pollution or something else, or marijuana smoke, okay? Anything that's got particulates in it that you're breathing in is irritating your airways is going to cause those airways to produce more mucus as a sort of defense reaction. Okay, they always produce some mucus because that helps to catch these little particulates, right? But if your airways are irritated, they're going to produce more mucus, sort of in an attempt to prevent that damage, right? Which means you're going to have to like get the mucus out. And the way that you get the mucus out, you could cough violently, right? But the way it naturally comes out is that the cilia lining your mucus, tiny little hairs, right? They sort of do the wave, is what we say, right? They sort of rhythmically move upwards and they push that mucus with all the particulates up into your pharynx, the place where you swallow. Now you've got this goopy mucus in your pharynx, and you could just swallow it, which we actually do unconsciously many times per day. Okay, if it's a big glob, you might spit it out or cough it out or something like that. Okay, but you're going to somehow get that out of your airways. And when I say airways, I'm using a general term for sort of like trachea, maybe down into some of your bronchial tubes. Cigarette smoking has an additional problem, which is that some of the chemicals in the cigarette smoke actually damage and paralyze these cilia that would normally be moving the mucus out. So not only are you making more mucus, you have a hard time getting it out. So now instead of sort of pushing it out without having to worry about it too much, you're coughing it out, right? And so you're going to be coughing much more frequently to get all of this mucus out. Okay, now fortunately that effect is pretty temporary. Within a fairly short period of time, if you don't smoke, those cilia, they're little hairs, so they just kind of regrow, right? And they'll sort of regrow and be more effective at pushing the mucus out. Okay, but if you're talking about cigarette smoke in particular with chronic bronchitis, you want to be aware of this sort of extra effect of paralyzing the cilia in places like your trachea. Okay, Juyeon Choi? I think that's who it is. I don't know if you're one of my students, so sometimes I can't always answer what you need to know for other classes. We're pretty similar, but sometimes there's a few differences, but I'll do the best I can. What do we need to know about the specific defenses, and to what extent do we need to know? Yeah, so if you've looked at all about the immune system, you're going to quickly realize it's really, really complicated, okay? So we're trying to, as best we can, kind of boil down to the immune system to some sort of basic ideas. Okay, so I do want people to understand that there's these different sort of like branches of the immune system. Okay, and that's really important because pathogens are able to sort of attack us in many ways. Okay, and they're pretty powerful. I mean, remember, lots of people die of infection. So we need to have like many ways of attacking them, different times, different ways, different places. Okay, some people like to use the military analogy that if we want to sort of defend the country, we're going to have like a navy in the sea, and we're going to have airplanes in the sky, we're going to have an army on the land, we're going to have the quick defense and then the specialized forces, like that sort of thing, right? So one of the types of immunity we have is what's called innate or nonspecific, and that means that it's kind of always on duty, like the guards at the entrance, right? And that's this thing where if you get a cut or you first start to breathe in some pathogens, right away you've got things that can respond to that. Okay, right away I've got some chemicals in my mouth that can generally attack pathogens. Right away I've got blood cells right near the surface of my skin that can fight off things that are coming in, pathogens that are coming in through a cut. Okay, right away that area around the cut is going to become inflamed, and lots of fluids and cells are going to come to try to keep any pathogens out. Okay, and that actually works a lot of the time. We keep most of the pathogens out of our body most of the time because they're all around us. So some of the time, of course, the pathogens do get in, and then you need a more powerful specific immune response. Specific immune response means that it's not general, it's able to target that particular pathogen. Okay, and the sequence of events for that to happen is pretty complicated. My sort of relatively short version would be that there's sort of two main branches of the specific immune system. One of them is to handle pathogens that are floating in your blood, okay, because they're in your blood going to all your cells, these pathogens, right? So that's mostly the realm of B cells, okay? And once the B cells know, certain B cells are activated that match the antigens on that particular pathogen. And when those B cells are activated, they multiply, we call it proliferate, and they make millions of that kind of B cell that matches this particular pathogen. Okay? And then all those millions of B cells start pumping out, they go by a different name at this point called plasma cells, but all of these cells start pumping out millions and millions and millions of antibodies, little proteins that swarm through all the blood in your body. right? And they start dogpiling on all the pathogens that they match. And so that quickly immobilizes, relatively quickly immobilizes these pathogens that are floating in your blood, and other cells can come along and eat them up. But that doesn't take care of the cells that have already been infected, because by now it's several days later and a bunch of your cells have been infected. So other parts of your immune system, killer T cells, they can actually help to kill the infected cells, right? Either kill them outright, or in some cases, the cells are caused to go through apoptosis sort of internally. Okay, so various ways that you attack these pathogens, whether they're generally in the blood or whether they've actually already infected your cells. So that's the specific immune system. Okay, I'm going to see if I can connect this to some more immune questions. So Round's asking about why we get the flu shots each year. Is it because there are many different versions of the virus that our body can't defend or something? Basically, the word we use for pathogens is strains, like strain. We would say that there's many different strains of the flu. And what that means is that they have evolved slightly and in many cases mixed and matched with other flu viruses. You might hear about them mixing and matching, for example, in pigs or you know, birds or something like that, and they mix and match their different parts, and then their antigens are a little bit different. Okay, and once their antigens are a little bit different, sometimes our immune system can no longer recognize them. So they're slightly different, and we can't mount that powerful specific immune response. So as long as different strains of the flu infect us, which is always going to happen, right? We're always going to get new strains of the flu. Now, I don't know specifically for the flu, but it's also possible that we don't get complete permanent immunity to some of the strains. I don't know the answer to that question. But what they do with the flu shots is they try to make sure that the sort of strains of the flu that are currently circulating around the world, and there's this, epidemiologists, people who study this, have an idea of how flu strains circulate. Like they tend to move geographically across the world. And so they try to predict, for example, what strains of the flu are going to be circulating within the next 6 months or something, right? And produce flu viruses, flu vaccines that will be able to attack those specific strains. So like if you get a flu shot, it might have, it might be effective against 5 or 6 strains of the flu that they think are going to be circulating 6 months from now. Okay. Now, of course, this isn't a perfect process because there might be some new strain of the flu that they didn't know was going to be circulating, right? So you could get a flu shot and still get the flu. Okay, that doesn't mean that flu vaccines don't work. It means that you got a strain of the flu that wasn't in that flu vaccine. There's also a possibility you just didn't have a good immune response, but usually it's just because you didn't get a vaccine for that particular strain. It's always a good idea to get a flu shot though, because many times they're right about the strains of the flu that are in the vaccine, and sometimes even if it's not the exact same strain, you'll still have some immunity because the antigens might be similar. So, definitely go out and get those flu shots if you haven't already, okay? And you really should get one by about October or so. I'm going to stick on immunity for a second here, so I'm going to go a little bit out of order. Ronit is asking about immune system instead of lymphatic system. Yeah, the reason I try to say lymphatic system because when we talk about body systems, we mean like a group of organs that work together, right? Like your respiratory system is your larynx and your pharynx and blah, 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 okay? The immune system is like a coordinated attack from really a bunch of body systems, right? I mean, part of what gives you immunity is your skin. Part of what gives you immunity is the fact that you can clot blood and stop things from coming in. Part of your immunity is that you've got white blood cells. Some of those white blood cells are in your blood, which is circulatory. Some of the white blood cells are in your lymphatic organs, right? So immunity is more like this coordinated set of actions that actually takes into account a bunch of body systems. It's not specific organs that are all sort of like connected in the way that organs of the respiratory system or the digestive system are connected. Okay, that's why it's awkward to say immune system. That being said, it kind of rolls off the tongue. It's what we're used to saying. We very casually in common usage talk about having a strong immune system. What we really mean is immunity, or that all those parts and processes are functioning well and we're able to have a good immune response. So if you want to be sort of more biologically accurate, you would use terms like immune response and immunity. Okay? the actual parts that are in a system are in the lymphatic system. And that's a very defined set of parts, right? It's your lymphatic vessels and your lymphoid organs, right? Things like the spleen and the appendix and bone marrow and the thymus, right? Like that's a system of parts. So in the sense of what we mean by like, you remember early in the year we learned about like cells, tissues, organs, and organ systems? So that idea of a system is like a set of parts that work together. Immunity is really includes all these processes with parts and cells that come from many different systems. Okay, so casually, it's not, it's not a horrible thing to say immune system. I say it sometimes when I mean kind of all of this working together, but in terms of body systems, it doesn't work well to describe any kind of a physical system. Okay, that's the difference. Okay, I'm going to go up to Ashley's before I forget. She's asking about angioplasty and stent insertion. Can the artery still re-narrow? Yeah, it can. Putting in a stent does push the plaque in the coronary artery aside, but remember, there's a couple things. A, they don't always leave the stent in there. Some stents are made to biodegrade, in which case the artery could re-narrow, either because it has new plaque forming or because it simply narrows. Okay. If you leave the stent in there, then you have sort of a separate problem. Not so much that it re-narrows on its own, but what happens is you will get plaque attaching to the stent or blood clots forming on the stent. Okay. And because it's like an irritation, right, in the artery. So in that case, that can almost essentially be like another heart attack, right? Because if you get blockage on the stent, it's called stenosis, then you're kind of in the same place you started. And that happens a decent amount of the time. I mean, the number, I'd have to look this up to see what the current numbers are, but the number that pops into my brain is 25%. It's a decent amount of the time. So there are people who have, a lot of atherosclerosis in their coronary arteries, and they have multiple stents and have gone in multiple times for stents. So it's a great temporary thing. And, this, in all fairness, of course, many stents last the rest of the person's life. And that's awesome. But not always. It's a significant risk factor that a stent will cause the artery to become blocked again. What is the pathway of the oxygen molecule to the heart? Okay, well, first of all, I think I know which question you're asking about, but you need to be more specific because the heart could be, the chambers of the heart, the blood cells of the heart, right? So be really specific. I will tell you on the written practical, if you're not super specific like that, you actually won't get full credit because I have no way of knowing if you understand about coronary circulation, right, or what's going on there. So that's just kind of some extra advice. But if you want to think about that, you can, and I'm not going through every single term because I want you to practice this, but the sort of general pathway would be that if I'm breathing in a molecule of oxygen, okay, it's going to have to move through all my respiratory parts, right? Then it's going to have to move through, it's going to end up in the alveoli, it's going to have to diffuse into the blood, and you can get really specific about the red blood cells and hemoglobin. Then that blood, which is now, think about where that is, okay, capillaries around the alveoli, okay? Why are there capillaries around the alveoli? Because in pulmonary circulation, blood from the heart goes to the lungs, branches out into all those capillaries around the alveoli, becomes oxygenated. So now that molecule of oxygen is there. And then that blood is going to return to the heart through, think about it, the pulmonary vein, right? But that just puts it into the chamber of the heart, specifically the, think about it, left atrium. Okay, so you'd have to follow that blood. Depends on where you think it's going. It's already in the heart. But if you mean the heart cells, you're going to have to think about the fact that heart cells are fed with blood that comes from coronary arteries, which originally branch off of the aorta. Okay, so these pathway questions are really excellent for putting lots of different parts together and sort of forcing you to combine systems. So you could try tracking molecules of different things, oxygen, glucose, salt, water, back and forth between different systems, because that's how it works in your body, right? Lots of things are moving around different places for different reasons. So play around with this idea. You guys know most of the systems now. We're really just going to add on a couple of more, and we're going to do some more of these pathways when we add on excretory system, okay? But definitely start playing around with moving things within and between systems. Okay, Ria's asking about let's see, common disorders of the blood. Okay, and I see some questions are building up, so I'm going to try to go a bit faster, but I've already covered a lot. So, um, I mean, I'm trying to think from memory, right? I mean, definitely check and see what's in the PowerPoint for sure, but and on your unit guide and your vocab list. But off the top of my head, the one that jumps to my mind, of course, is anemia, right? So you're going to want to know about some of the common types of anemia: iron deficiency anemia, sickle cell anemia, hemophilia is going to be one that we've studied in class. I mean, of course, the reality is there's hundreds, but we're sort of focusing on a few disorders, right? You could have leukemia or lymphoma, which is cancer in your blood. Yeah, those are the ones that jump to my mind right now. Okay, Arthur, good response about the flu. Yeah, it's a good description. In terms of the thymus gland and the thymus tissue, there's not that much of a difference. In fact, when I was looking it up in the book today because I was trying to answer a student's question, and the book sort of described it as those ones in the neck just kind of like extend into that tissue over the heart. So I don't think for practical purposes, in terms of its function, there's really much difference at all. It all does the same thing as far as I know. Just for thinking about the different places, I know that the biology teachers usually refer to the patches on the side of the throat as the thymus glands, and the sort of bigger patch that's over the heart as the thymus tissue. But again, it really isn't that big of a deal. Okay, and in fact, on the Pig Practical, on the cards on the Pig Practical, they just say thymus, right? Because it's not that important. It's okay to just say thymus. Okay, Ria's asking about community immunity. Okay, so let's see if there's anything else about. Okay, and there's one about chemotherapy too. So we're going to put that in. It's a couple of immunity related ones. Okay, so if you think about this idea that diseases need to spread from person to person, right? So sometimes we think about what's going on in one person's body. We do that a lot, actually, right? But the reality is, if you're talking about something like disease transmission, they really need to spread from one person to the other, or nothing's ever going to happen. Okay, they're just going to if you were the only person on earth and you lived in a bubble, you would get a disease and then you would be gone and then the disease would be gone, right? Because it would have nowhere else to go. So what happens is that there's really sort of like a community of people, right? And I'm drawing a little picture here that I'm going to show you. Okay, so if you've got kind of a community of people, and you can almost think of this as like a network, right? If this person out here should get a disease, say it's say it's even like a cold, right? Well, let's make it a communicable disease. Well, one that we have a vaccine for. So I'm not sure you guys can see this super well. There's little orange dots. If this person out here should get, say, the measles, let's say there were no vaccines, okay? And this person out here gets the measles. Let me make it up here. They could pass it to this person, who could pass it to these three people, right? Who would pass it to these people. And lots of people would get the measles. And that potentially would be what we call an epidemic, right? Now, one of the main purposes of vaccines is not just to protect you, right? But to protect from the spread of disease in general, okay? And the idea then is that if many people in this network, and a lot of them, like 95% or something, are protected, then say, now this person is exposed to the measles, right? But they've been vaccinated, okay? So they're not transmitting it to anybody. And if 95% of these people have been vaccinated, they're not transmitting it to anybody because they can't even be infected long enough to start to spread it. And not only does that protect you as individuals, but this person right here, that's a mom with a new baby. Her baby can't be vaccinated. This person over here, they're immune compromised and vaccines don't work well in them. So by having all these people around them who have been vaccinated, it's like keeping your babies in the middle of the herd. We call it herd immunity. The disease will never spread to get to these people because diseases sort of fizzle out if they can't get spread to enough people, because there's sort of only a limited period of time that it has to infect a person and be spread. Okay? So by having these people who cannot be vaccinated be protected in the community because everybody else in the community has immunity, right? You can prevent the spread of disease, and you can prevent these people who cannot get vaccines from being infected at all. Okay? Now, of course, the converse of this is if you have a whole bunch of people, it doesn't even have to be a whole bunch. If you've got a cluster of people, these people right here who are like, I'm not going to get a vaccine because I saw somebody on the internet say that it causes autism, and I'm not going to read about the science. Okay? Then what's going to happen is they will potentially start to spread the disease, and maybe one of them will spread it to this baby or this immune compromised person. Or some of these people who get the disease will die. Not everybody who gets the disease dies, right? I mean, if you get the measles, you don't necessarily die, but a certain proportion of people who get the measles die, and especially, babies and older people and people who are immune compromised. So if you start to have these outbreaks like we've had with the measles, then what happens is that a bunch of people get the measles who wouldn't have gotten it. Some of them, of course, recovered, right? Some of those unvaccinated people who got the measles die from the measles, and some of them pass it on to others who could not be vaccinated or did not have a good immune response to their vaccination, and those people die, right? And so that's why it is so important for everybody who can be immunized to be immunized, because again, we need to have, so often upwards of 90 or 95% of people be vaccinated in order to get this community immunity, right? So the ability for us to do this literally saves tens of thousands of lives. I mean, what am I saying? Millions of lives a year. The tens of thousands is the number of people who are dying today because, vaccines aren't being given to everyone, right? So the number of preventable deaths from vaccine preventable deaths is in the tens of thousands. It's a tremendous number because it's very hard to get vaccines to everybody. Sometimes we can't do it because, they live in a place that's hard to get to or something like that. But unfortunately, in recent times, it's because significant numbers of people are refusing vaccination or delaying them or something like that. So that's an enormous problem in terms of public health and killing a lot of people that don't need to die. Okay, a couple questions about CPR here, so let me just read the responses and see if I'd like to add anything. Okay, so there's a question about why can't we perform CPR as soon as they're showing signs? Okay, so I guess my question for you is, what do you mean by signs, right? So Arthur gave a good response there, right? They're completely not circulating blood and unresponsive. And I will tell you from teaching first aid that the easiest way to tell this is if they're not breathing. You can see from across the room. Try it with a friend. If somebody's lying on the ground, you can see from across the room whether their chest is rising and falling and whether they're breathing. Okay, if you want to be sure, you get up close to them, you put your head right down by their mouth, you look for breathing at their chest, you feel for breathing on your face, and you can determine that. Generally speaking, we don't even really bother to check for pulse because usually if somebody's not breathing, their heart is not beating either or won't be soon, and then you would start CPR. Okay, but yeah, you do not want to do CPR on somebody who's still breathing or has a heartbeat because CPR is not pleasant. Okay, like you're going to break stuff. It's not something you do, and you don't want to interfere with the normal flow of the blood with CPR unless it's absolutely necessary. It's just a stopgap. Okay, remember that it's not going to fix a heart attack. It's not going to fix cardiac arrest. It simply physically moves the blood around, and in some cases reoxygenates it if you blow oxygen into their mouth and nose, usually mouth if it's an adult, and allow a little bit more oxygenation of the tissues until more effective kinds of care can be given, right? Whether that's an AED to stop the fibrillation of the heart or various things that can be done to help with a heart attack, okay? So assuming in most cases, take a first aid course, like this is not a complete first aid course, but in most cases, the first thing you're going to want to do is call 911, okay? If the person is collapsed and it's likely that it's cardiac arrest and there's an AED around, get that, okay? CPR is actually the last of those three. But if there's enough people around, you would do all those at once. Okay? So take a first aid course. And specifically, by the way, a CPR AED course. Okay, Ronit's asking, how does a virus infect a cell? So I've drawn this on the board before. I know you guys can't see this whiteboard great, but this is a concept that's hard for me to describe without a picture. So here's a cell, right? And here's a virus. And it literally, a lot of viruses have sort of a capsule that's got their DNA or RNA in it. Okay, I'm trying to turn this a little bit more towards you. Okay, so it's got their nucleic acids here. And then it somehow binds to a cell. I can tell you guys can't see this very well. Okay, that's a little bit better if I put it in that angle. Okay, and this is important, this idea of binding to the cell, because it has to have a place to bind. So what we can do, like we know, for example, for HIV, that it attaches to a particular receptor on cells, right? So that helps us to understand how it works. It helps us to understand why some people are resistant if they don't have the same receptor, et cetera, et cetera. So the virus has to somehow sort of bind to the cell, and then it is able to inject its DNA or RNA, different types of viruses, inside of the cell, and then that DNA and RNA can start to take over your cell, right? It actually inserts itself. It can insert itself in your own DNA. It can use the enzymes in your cell to produce viral proteins and start to build more little proteins. It can live inside your cell for a while. All kinds of bad things can happen. Okay, so the short answer, how a virus infects your cell, it has to bind to it somehow and then inject its genetic material inside the cell. Okay. Okay, I'm going to take a moment to screen through some questions here. Okay, there's a question about losing blood. Hannah, I sort of answered your question about the heart attack or stroke. Somebody I know responded with the fast for the stroke. Yes, very good for looking at one side of the body changing, etc., slurred speech. Heart attacks can have a variety. So strokes can have a variety of symptoms. Depends what part of the brain is being affected. It could be speech, it could be movement, it could be vision. Okay. Heart attacks can also have a variety of symptoms. The sort of classic one you see on TV is like pain in the heart that radiates down one arm. That sometimes happens, especially more often in men, but the symptoms can be less obvious. Sometimes it's sort of back pain, or sometimes you feel kind of nauseated or really tired, right? And especially women tend to have these less obvious and more variable symptoms, which makes it tricky, right? You just have to do the best you can. If the person already has a heart condition, that might be a clue, right? Otherwise, certainly if there's any chest pain involved, I would assume that's a likely possibility. But if you're not sure and somebody's feeling pretty bad, and especially if there's somebody who's, not a teenager, right? Most people have heart attacks, or at least in their 40s or 50s or 60s or more, then, definitely suspect that that's possible and get some emergency care right away. Question about how can we lose a lot of our blood. I can't remember if the number is as high as 50%. It depends on a couple things, if the blood was lost quickly or slowly. You can afford to lose more blood slowly because it doesn't affect your blood pressure as much, and I went into some detail on that earlier in the live stream. But ultimately, if you lose the blood more slowly, the problem, because then your blood pressure can be fairly easily maintained, because it's not hard for your body to have more water be absorbed into your blood, right? So pretty quickly, as soon as you basically drink some water, okay, you can restore your blood volume. What's harder to restore is the platelets, the blood clotting factors, the red blood cells, all the components of your blood that are doing other functions. So if you dilute the blood, or there's just simply less of it, you're going to have less red blood cells, which means less oxygenation of your tissues. You're going to have fewer platelets, which means maybe not so good at stopping bleeding quickly, fewer clotting proteins, not so good at building those blood clots, et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to lose some of the functionality of your blood. But as long as you have enough functionality, and you're not getting a bunch more cuts, and you're not having a massive infection to fight, and you're not maybe too active so that you have enough oxygenation, at least to your brain, right? Then your body will sort of gradually rebuild your blood. Your body's always making new blood. The blood you have now is not the same blood you had even just a week ago, right? Your body is constantly producing new red blood cells and getting rid of the old ones. It's producing new platelets, right? New clotting factors can be produced through protein synthesis. So you simply make more until it builds up to the level that it was before. Question about chemotherapy. So chemotherapy is a pretty broad term. It's any one of many different chemicals that we give people to attempt to kill or inactivate cancer cells. Okay? Traditionally, most chemotherapy drugs are basically poisons. Okay? They're basically poisons that are toxic to cells, usually by killing them in some way related to cell division. Okay? And that's important because the assumption is that cancer cells are dividing rapidly. So if you have some toxin that interferes with cell division, then you could kill those rapidly dividing cancer cells. Now, of course, the problem is that you have other rapidly dividing cells, like the cells lining your intestines divide really rapidly, the hair follicles, right? Things like this. And even the cells in your bone marrow that produce new blood cells, they divide really rapidly. So the chemotoxins would kill all of those cells, or at least maybe not all of them, but many of them. And so you'd get these, you get these really unpleasant side effects. A lot of problems with digestion and hair falling out and low blood cell counts, right? Which can be deadly. And it was always it's always been a careful balance. Like, you can kill somebody with chemotherapy. It happens. So you sort of don't want to have it be so bad that the person can't tolerate it, but you want to try to kill the cancer cells. Okay. What's been happening the last several years of cancer treatment is the development of kinds of chemotherapy that are better able to target just cancer cells and not your healthy cells. Cancer cells are your cells, but your non-cancerous cells, right? And perhaps render them not able to continue to grow in a way that doesn't actually kill any other cells. Okay, so there's a lot of work to try to do that better. We won't go into all that right now, but that's basically the idea, is to try to kill the cancer cells. Okay, we have a question from an unidentified person about the function of the diaphragm. Okay, so the function of it is to basically to change the pressure in your chest cavity or thoracic cavity so that air will go in and out. So you could say that it helps you breathe, right? It's not the only thing that makes it doesn't control your breathing. It's not the only thing that causes breathing to occur, but it's one of the main muscles that, when it contracts and flattens, that increases this volume of your your chest cavity or thoracic cavity. When you increase the volume, that decreases the pressure. When the pressure decreases and the pressure is now higher outside, then the air comes in, and that's when you inhale. To exhale, your diaphragm's contracted down here. You're going to relax that diaphragm back into its curved up position. That's going to slightly decrease the volume, and that's going to increase the pressure in your chest cavity or thoracic cavity. And that higher pressure means the air is going to move out to the lower pressure outside. Okay? And again, not the only thing that does this. You have muscles all around your chest that can help with this process, but it's part of what changes this volume and pressure in your thoracic cavity and allows your lungs to fill with air and move the air out, and for the air to go in and out of your lungs, essentially. Yeah, thanks, Arthur. You're doing really appreciate your help tonight, Arthur. You're giving lots of good responses. Okay, and I see Arthur also put in a good response to the red blood cell concentration, and potentially there might be an issue with blood clotting as well, but I think he's right that the oxygenation issue is probably a bigger problem. And it depends how severe that is. I mean, if you have somewhat low oxygenation, it's like having anemia. You're going to be tired and not have great stamina, but you're not necessarily going to fall down and die. Okay, but if it's severe, yeah, you could start to have tissue damage from cells dying. Okay, yeah, by and large, what you guys are saying about the blood volume and stuff is accurate. So Rayon is saying, so we would put a saline solution if needed to raise blood pressure, which would dilute blood and decrease oxygen carrying capacity, but will allow blood to circulate well. Yeah, excellent summary, Rayon. Yeah, that's exactly accurate. Yeah, but you would die if your brain doesn't receive oxygen. But if the blood's flowing, your brain's going to receive oxygen, unless there's no oxygen in your blood. Okay, that's another problem, which could happen. It's actually somewhat difficult for that to happen under normal circumstances. I mean, I guess if you're sort of like, choking or something like that, then you're not getting oxygen into the blood and your blood is still circulating. So I guess in that situation where somehow your airway is blocked, you could have blood circulating and still not get enough oxygen to your brain. Suraj is asking, how much will we have to know about electron chain transport? Nothing for this quiz. Okay, first of all, it's the electron transport chain, ETC, as it's known. So that's relevant to the process of cellular respiration. That's part of the process of cellular respiration that is used to build ATP. But we didn't even include that when we learned about cellular respiration. So it's not something that you need to know now, okay? As long as you understand that cellular respiration produces ATP, that's as much as you need to know, okay? Take AP Bio if you want to learn about the ETC. Arthur's asking about chemotherapy. There's I've heard of a bunch of different ways. Sometimes they've tried so many things. They've tried changing the environment so that the cancer cells aren't getting the blood supply. That didn't work as well as they thought it would work. They've tried changing the environment so that it has more or less oxygen. They've tried targeting particular chemicals that cancer cells put out. The newer methods, and I think what's very exciting for people, is using genetic things. Like, could you somehow genetically target differences in the cancer cells? The other really hot area in cancer therapy right now is actually changing our own immune cells to recognize the cancer cells and getting our immune system to kill them rather than putting these poisons in, right? So it really comes down to the fact that we're able to learn more, and you can tie this into genetics and biotechnology, that we're learning more and more about how the genetics of cancer cells changes when our own cells become cancerous. Genes are expressed differently. There's more mutations and chromosomal differences, so that if we could target the cells in that way, target these genetic differences, and either prevent the genetic changes or target them once they've occurred, then those would all be good treatments for cancer. In common usage, anytime they kind of stick a needle in you and infuse chemicals into you, they tend to call it chemotherapy, even if it works in a lot of different ways. Some people will use terms like immune therapy, but they still stick a needle in your arm and infuse these things into you. So, sort of in common usage, I think the term chemotherapy is still thrown around a lot and can potentially mean a lot of different things. Yeah, so you ask a good question around about could we change the genes? Yeah, potentially, right? Interestingly, I think they're thinking of CRISPR more for changing our immune cells. So, say if you could take out my T cells, okay, and change them so that they will, instead of attacking, measles or something, that they will attack my cancer cells. I think they're looking more at genetic modification of those kinds of cells and then reinfusing them back into the body to kill cancer cells. Um, I I mean, I don't know a lot about this, but my initial thought would be that it would be pretty complicated because by the time we know somebody has cancer, there are millions upon millions of cancer cells by that point, and they have many mutations. So fixing it wouldn't be so easy. Like your average cancer cell might have 10 mutations or more. So you'd have to fix it. You'd have to try to fix them all. Like that, I could see that being difficult. It doesn't mean that that technology won't help us. I think ultimately it will, and it might allow us to fix some cancer-causing mutations before they actually lead to cancer. Because remember, your cells can have a lot of cancer-causing mutations that may or may not ever lead to cancer, right? They have to accumulate over time. So if you were born with some of these mutations, potentially that would be something we could fix, like in an embryo. If we could find that that embryo had some mutations that predispose people to cancer, like the BRCA mutation. You don't get it right away, but you're more likely to get it at a younger age. We could potentially change those with CRISPR. So I think those are some ways that that might be used. Okay. Okay, I think I'm actually caught up with the questions. So I'm going to wait another minute or so just to see if some more questions come in. But, we'll try to wrap this up in just a few. Trying to think if there's anything that hasn't been covered. A couple reminders. Know a bunch of different effects of smoking. Make sure that you can describe both the risks and prevention for atherosclerosis and coronary artery disease. The obvious things like the pathway of air and the pathway of blood through the heart. What are some other areas that people tend to struggle with? Function of the diaphragm, right? Regulation of breathing, how vaccines work, community immunity. Okay, these are all things that are definitely going to be on the quiz. Yeah, and then many of the things we covered tonight. Let's see if there's anything else that I want to address here. Just detect masses. Yeah, I know what you mean, Rayon. There are many differences between cancer cells and our own cells. They're not exactly the same. As they become cancerous, they do start to get different, kind of weird in a lot of ways. They have a lot more mutations and they get a lot of this chromosomal damage that occurs, like broken chromosomes and that sort of thing. They start behaving differently, right? Not only do they divide more frequently, but they start putting out chemicals to kind of control their local environment and to harm other cells. So there's, quite a few differences that we could potentially target. Okay, and then a question about the pig practical. Okay, so keep in mind for the pig practicals, it's not so much about the study guides. I mean, the general information is, but you want to focus in on those terms that are on the list. Those are the ones that you physically need to identify. Then you could also use your study guides to think about, okay, how would I describe the functions of these things using the more general knowledge that's on the study guides, okay? But remember, the terms do not overlap perfectly, right? So for example, you've had the kidney since the beginning because we could see it in the abdominal cavity, but we haven't even gotten to the excretory system yet, right? So you're going to have to kind of go back and forth a bit to make sure that you're covering all the information, okay? But we're almost there. We've only got a couple systems to go. So you're on the track. Okay. Okay, let's go ahead and start to wrap it up. I wish you guys all the best. Thanks for hanging out for my live stream on a Wednesday night. And, if you want to hear more, there is a full live stream that I think went on for a longer period of time from last year, and it would be very similar topics, but slightly different as well, right? People would ask it in different ways. I might give slightly different explanations. So feel free to check that out if you think it would help you. But otherwise, don't overdo either. If you've been working hard and you know this stuff and you felt comfortable with all the questions that were on the review, for those of you in first through third period, you'll get that review tomorrow, then honestly, you're probably in pretty good shape, okay? So just remember to use good reading skills and, practice with the actual writing out of some of the words, okay? Suraj, one last point on that. We don't entirely know the function of the urogenital papilla in the pigs. It's not a part that humans have. It's been proposed that that has something to do with reproduction in the sense of maybe being part of the mating process or secreting pheromones or something like that. We're not really sure, and frankly, not that important for us, right? It's more of a marker that tells us it's a female, and it is the location of the urogenital opening, okay? So I don't know if it has something to do with mating or not. Okay, I haven't watched pigs that closely. Okay, we'll leave it for Nat at that. Thanks so much for coming tonight, and I wish you all the best on the quiz, and I will see you guys later in the week. Take care. Have a great night.